There's an old idea, repeated so often it's almost lost its meaning, that says character reveals itself in the big moments, in crisis, in tragedy, in the moments life truly tests a person. And that idea isn't wrong exactly, but it's incomplete. And its incompleteness is exactly why so many people get fooled, sometimes for years, by people who were never who they appeared to be. Because the truth is, you don't need a crisis to see someone's real character. You need exactly two things. And once you know what they are, you will never look at people the same way again. The first thing is this: how someone treats people who can do absolutely nothing for them. Let that sit for a second because it sounds simple, almost obvious, and yet it is one of the most consistently ignored pieces of information in how we judge the people around us. Watch how someone speaks to a waiter who got their order wrong. Watch how they treat a cashier who's clearly having a rough day, or a customer service representative on the other end of a frustrating phone call, or a stranger who accidentally bumps into them on a crowded street. These are the moments where a mask, if there is one, becomes almost impossible to maintain, because there's genuinely nothing to gain from performing kindness in that specific moment. No audience that matters. No potential benefit. No social capital to accumulate. Just a raw, unfiltered glimpse of what a person actually believes other human beings deserve, when there's no reason left to pretend otherwise. This is exactly why so many people get blindsided by someone's character later in a relationship, whether romantic, professional, or platonic. Because in the early stages, we're almost always watching someone perform for an audience that matters to them, and we mistake that performance for the whole truth. Someone can be genuinely charming, warm, attentive, even generous toward people whose opinion of them actually affects their life. That's not evidence of character. That's evidence of social intelligence, which is a completely different trait, and one that has almost nothing to do with actual goodness. Real character shows up in the gaps, the moments between the moments that matter to their image. It's the tone someone uses with a barista after they've already gotten what they came for. It's whether someone tips generously when no one's watching them do it, or makes a show of tipping generously specifically because someone is watching. It's whether they're patient with an elderly person moving slowly in front of them in a checkout line, or whether an audible sigh escapes the second nobody important enough to matter to them is looking. Here's why this particular signal is so reliable, from a purely psychological standpoint. Treating people who cannot benefit you well requires an internal value system that isn't contingent on external reward. It means the kindness is coming from an actual belief that people deserve basic respect simply for being people, not from a calculated understanding of who's useful to keep happy. And that distinction matters enormously, because the second kind of kindness, the transactional kind, will always, eventually, run out the moment the transaction changes. The friend who's warm to you while you're useful to their social status will get cold the moment you're not. The partner who's attentive while you're providing something they need will disappear the moment your circumstances change and you need something from them instead. I want to tell you about something I noticed watching two very different people interact with the exact same barista over the same week. One of them, every single time, remembered the barista's name, asked how her day was going, and meant it. You could tell, the way you can always tell the difference between a scripted "how are you" and a genuine one, in the pause before the answer, in whether the person actually waits to hear it. The other person was pleasant, technically, polite words, a practiced smile, but there was a specific kind of impatience underneath it, a slight tightness whenever the line moved slowly, a subtle dismissiveness in how quickly he turned away the second his coffee was handed over, as if the interaction had already served its purpose and there was no reason to extend it a second longer than necessary. Now, here's the part that made this genuinely fascinating to watch unfold over time. Both of these people, in professional and social settings where their reputation mattered, were considered, genuinely by most people who knew them, to be kind, likable, good people. Because in those settings, being kind served a purpose. It built alliances, maintained image, secured favor. But only one of them was actually kind, in the sense that matters. the sense that predicts how they'll treat you once you're no longer useful, once you're vulnerable, once you're the one who needs patience rather than the one extending it. This is the exact reason why paying attention to how someone treats waitstaff, service workers, strangers on the street, anyone with zero social leverage over them, has become such a well-known piece of relationship advice, almost to the point of being a cliché. But clichés become clichés because they're true often enough to be worth repeating. And this one holds up remarkably well under scrutiny, precisely because it strips away the one variable that distorts almost every other read we get on a person: incentive. Now let's talk about the second thing, because it's just as important, and in some ways even harder to observe, which is exactly why it gets missed so often: how someone behaves when they're wrong. Not when they've done something catastrophic. That's a different, more obvious test. I mean the small, mundane moments. Misremembering a detail in an argument. Making an assumption about someone that turns out to be inaccurate. Giving advice that turns out to be bad. Being simply, plainly, factually incorrect about something in front of other people. These moments are almost designed by life to test something very specific about a person's internal architecture, whether their sense of self can survive being wrong, or whether being wrong feels to them like an existential threat that must be defended against at any cost. Watch what happens in that exact moment, because it tells you almost everything about how they'll handle every future conflict you'll ever have with them. Some people, when shown they're wrong, do something remarkably simple and remarkably rare. They just say, "Oh, you're right, I was wrong about that." No drama, no defensiveness, no immediate pivot to a different argument to save face. Just a clean, uncomplicated acknowledgement, because their sense of worth was never actually tied to being right in the first place. Other people, when shown they're wrong, do something completely different. And if you've ever been in a relationship with someone like this, you already know exactly what I'm describing before I even finish the sentence. They deflect. They change the subject just slightly, reframing the conversation around something you did wrong instead, so the conversation ends somewhere completely different from where it started, and you somehow end up apologizing, even though you were the one who was right. Or they minimize. It's not that big of a deal. Suddenly, the moment the facts stop favoring them, even though 30 seconds earlier, when they thought they were right, it was an enormous deal worth arguing passionately about. Or, in the most extreme version, they simply rewrite what happened entirely, with total conviction, until you start questioning your own memory of a conversation that happened 5 minutes ago. This second signal matters just as much as the first one, maybe even more, because it predicts something the first signal can't fully capture on its own: how safe it will actually feel to be honest with this person over the long run. Because every relationship, no matter how good, eventually requires moments of correction, telling someone they hurt you, pointing out a mistake, disagreeing about something that matters. And if someone cannot tolerate being wrong in the small, low-stakes moments, a wrong fact, a wrong assumption, a wrong turn on a road trip, you already have your answer for how they're going to handle the much higher stakes moments. The ones where the stakes are your feelings, your needs, your version of a shared history. And here's what's genuinely fascinating when you put these two signals together, side by side, because they're not actually testing two unrelated things. They're testing the exact same underlying quality, just from two different angles. Both of them are measuring whether a person's sense of self-worth is internally generated or whether it depends entirely on external conditions, on being seen as useful, on being seen as right, on maintaining a version of themselves that requires constant defending and constant performing. Someone whose self-worth comes from inside themselves can afford to be kind to someone who can't repay it, because the kindness was never a transaction to begin with. And that exact same person can afford to be wrong out loud in front of other people because being wrong doesn't threaten who they actually are underneath. Someone whose self-worth depends entirely on external validation cannot afford either of those things. Kindness, for them, has to serve a purpose, because unearned kindness feels, to their internal system, like a wasted resource. And being wrong feels catastrophic, because their entire identity is built on a foundation that requires constant reinforcement from the outside. Which means any crack in that foundation, even a small factual one, has to be defended against immediately, aggressively, at whatever cost to the truth or to you. This is why these two signals, more than almost anything else, more than how someone dresses, more than how charming they are on a first date, more than how impressively they can talk about their own values, actually predict long-term character. Because character was never really about what someone says about themselves. It's about what they do in the two specific kinds of moments where there's genuinely nothing to gain from performing goodness at all. And once you start watching for these two things specifically, instead of the 100 other less reliable signals we're taught to pay attention to, you'll start noticing something remarkable. The pattern becomes almost impossible to miss. And that's exactly where we're headed next. What to actually do with this information once you start seeing it clearly, and why one of these two signals, in particular, tends to matter even more than the other when it comes to predicting how someone will eventually treat you. So let's get into that. Which of these two signals actually matters more? Because I promised you an answer, and the answer is going to surprise some of you because it's not the one people usually assume. Most people, when they first hear about these two signals, assume the first one, how someone treats people who can't benefit them, is the more important predictor. And it's easy to understand why. It's the more visible one, the one that shows up in a single observable moment, the one that makes for a clean, satisfying story. Watch how he treats the waiter, and you'll know everything you need to know. But if you actually track relationships over years rather than single moments, the second signal, how someone handles being wrong, tends to matter more because of one simple, unavoidable fact about long-term relationships. You will spend far more of your life being in conflict, disagreement, and correction with the people close to you than you will ever spend watching them interact with strangers. Think about it honestly. How often, over the course of a year, do you actually witness your partner, your best friend, your family member interacting with a waiter or a stranger on the street? A handful of times, maybe. Now think about how often, over that same year, some version of being wrong comes up between you. A misremembered conversation, a miscommunication, an assumption that turned out to be unfair, a moment where you needed them to simply say, "You're right, I got that wrong." Dozens of times, maybe hundreds, in a genuinely close relationship. This is the terrain you'll actually be living on together, day after day, for years. And someone's capacity to handle that terrain with humility rather than defensiveness ends up determining the entire emotional climate of the relationship, far more than any single interaction with a stranger ever will. Here's why this matters so much, in practical terms, and I want to walk you through exactly what it looks like when this second signal goes wrong over time, because it rarely announces itself all at once. It erodes something slowly, almost invisibly, relationship by relationship, argument by argument, until one day you look up and realize you've spent years walking on eggshells around a person's inability to simply be wrong out loud. It usually starts small. You mention gently that something they said hurt you, and instead of hearing it, they immediately explain why you shouldn't have been hurt, why your reaction was disproportionate, why you're misunderstanding their intention. And because this happens gently, reasonably, wrapped in seemingly logical explanations, you don't notice, at first, that what's actually happening is that your experience keeps getting overwritten by their explanation of your experience. Once, then twice. Then it becomes the pattern of the entire relationship. Not through cruelty necessarily, but through a nervous system that genuinely cannot tolerate the discomfort of simply sitting in, "I was wrong, that hurt you, I'm sorry," without immediately needing to restore its own sense of being fundamentally good, fundamentally right, fundamentally blameless. And here is the quiet tragedy hidden inside this specific dynamic. The person on the receiving end of it usually doesn't blame the other person first. They blame themselves. Because when your hurt keeps getting explained away, reframed, minimized again and again, you don't conclude, "This person can't handle being wrong." You conclude, "Maybe I really am too sensitive, too much, too quick to feel hurt over nothing." Because that conclusion, painfully, is actually easier to live with than the alternative, which is realizing that someone you love simply cannot make room for your reality when it conflicts with theirs. This is exactly why the second signal, the wrongness signal, deserves so much more attention than it typically gets in early relationships, whether romantic, platonic, or professional. Because in the beginning, disagreements are rare and low stakes. Someone can seem wonderfully humble, wonderfully easygoing, simply because you haven't yet disagreed about anything that actually matters. It's only once the relationship deepens, once there's real history, real vulnerability, real stakes involved in being right or wrong, that this signal reveals its true shape. Which means, tragically, a lot of people don't discover this about someone until they're already years in, already emotionally invested, already structurally entangled in a life built alongside this person. So, here's what I want to leave you with practically, because recognizing these two signals is only useful if you know what to actually do once you see them clearly. First, start testing early, deliberately, in low-stakes moments, rather than waiting for life to test it for you in high-stakes ones. You don't need to manufacture a crisis to see someone's character. You just need to pay attention to the small, ordinary moments that are already happening around you constantly. How they talk about the barista who got the order wrong, how they react the one time you gently point out they misremembered something small. These moments are happening whether you're watching for them or not. The only difference is whether you're actually paying attention or letting them slide by, unprocessed, the way most people do. Second, notice your own reaction when you see the red flag version of either signal, because here's the uncomfortable truth about pattern recognition. Seeing it and believing it are two completely different skills, and most people are actually fairly good at the first one and remarkably bad at the second. You'll notice the slight rudeness to the waiter. You'll notice the defensiveness when you mention something small. And then almost immediately, your mind will start generating explanations to protect the relationship from the implication of what you just saw. He was just having a bad day. She's just tired. She's not usually like this. Sometimes that's true. But if you find yourself generating that explanation over and over for the same behavior across months or years, that repetition is itself the data. A single instance is a moment. A pattern is character. And third, the hardest one. Understand that recognizing someone's character clearly doesn't obligate you to do anything about it immediately. This isn't about becoming a person who cuts people off the second they're rude to a stranger or defensive about one small mistake. Humans are inconsistent, complicated, capable of growth. What actually matters is whether the pattern once named has any capacity to shift, and the only way to find that out is the same way we talked about a few episodes back, naming it gently, honestly, and watching not what they say in response, but what they actually do differently afterward. I want to leave you with an image, because I think it captures something about character that's very hard to say directly. Picture someone building a house entirely out of glass, beautiful from a distance. Sunlight moves through it in ways that make it look almost magical, catching the eye of everyone who walks by. But glass, no matter how beautifully it's cut, has one defining property that no amount of polish can change. The moment real pressure is applied, a storm, an impact, anything that actually tests its structure, it doesn't bend. It doesn't creak a warning first. It shatters all at once and often takes whoever's standing closest to it down with it. Now picture a second house, built from something far less dazzling. Timber, maybe. Something that doesn't catch the light quite the same way, doesn't turn heads on a first impression. But timber has a property glass will never have. When pressure comes, it bends. It groans under the weight, visibly, honestly. You can hear it struggling. You can watch it adjust. But it holds. It was built, from the very first beam, to withstand exactly the kind of pressure it's now facing, because its strength was never about how it looked standing still. It was about what it was actually made of underneath. Character works exactly the same way. Some people are glass, dazzling in the moments that don't matter, charming in every low-stakes interaction, beautiful from a comfortable distance. But the instant real pressure arrives, a mistake that needs owning, a stranger who deserves patience they don't have anything to gain from giving, they shatter all at once, and you finally see what was always underneath the shine. and some people are timber, less dazzling on the surface maybe. Not always the most impressive person in the room on a first impression. But when the storm actually comes, and it always comes, eventually, for every relationship worth having, they bend without breaking, because their strength was never a performance to begin with. It was simply what they were made of, the whole time, quietly, long before anyone was watching closely enough to notice. The work, then, isn't learning to admire the glass from a distance. It's learning to walk close enough, early enough to find out, before the storm arrives, exactly what you're actually standing inside of.